Hello and welcome back to the Bird's Eye View podcast. We are here on Monday, April 22nd, after the Toronto Blue Jays failed yet again to finish off a sweep. I'm your host, Zach Worden, joined as always by Jori Negin-Shecter, and we are super excited to have Nick Ashbourne on with us today. Nick is a Blue Jays contributor at Sportsnet and the co-host of the Blue Jays Happy Hour podcast. Nick, thanks so much for taking the time to join us today.
Oh, no problem. It's a pleasure to be here.
All right, so let's just dive in right away. Blue Jays coming off a loss to the Padres. They all have sinus infections, apparently. I'm curious from you, is their inability to sweep teams this early in the season a concern to you? Is it something that you really care about, or are you just kind of more on it's a positive sign that they're winning series right now?
Yeah, I mean, I find it funny that the kind of vibes and discussion on the team ends up being so negative when they end these series on these negative notes with these losses. Because yeah, they've won a bunch of series in a row. I know the overall record is not fantastic, and there's some underlying stuff you can look at in terms of run differential and say like this team is not absolutely rolling by any stretch of the imagination. But that as a specific concern seems odd to me because it's just not a flaw. I don't think that teams are going to have. Like, you're going to be good enough to win a bunch of games in a row, or you're not going to be. Like, I think at some point during the season, they'll probably have an extensive winning streak. At some point during the season, they'll probably have a more extensive losing streak than we've seen. It's just, this is kind of what happens with variance. And you can dig into the individual games and find legitimate concerns there for sure. But if you're thinking they can't finish a series, I'm not sure that's a big picture worry for the team going forward.
One thing that the past couple episodes where it's just been Jori and I, we've kind of been, questioning who this team is and if it's really all that different from the 2023 version of the Blue Jays that we saw a year ago. And I'm curious for you seeing them almost kind of settle into the year now a little bit where it does look a little bit better. Obviously, like you said, they've won a couple series in a row, but what have you kind of been your early takeaways from the team as far as like the 2024 version maybe being something different than they were last year?
Yeah, I understand when people watch this team and they see those similarities because the strengths and weaknesses of the team, big picture, are relatively similar to what we saw last year, right? Like, what this team is best at is defense, which is not a sexy thing to be your primary skill, but that's a reality. That's like the one thing the Blue Jays do incredibly well. Their second best strength is pitching. Their offense is a little bit of a get on base and try to get extended rallies going type of offense. There isn't a ton of power compared to, I don't know, say the Orioles and their division or teams like that who are reliant on the home run. So when it comes to the shape of the team and you're kind of zoomed out, there are a lot of similarities. What it's going to come down to in terms of whether there's a different result, I think, is whether a few individual players are able to change the narratives a bit, right? Like, is Vladdy going to have a season that's more reminiscent? Maybe not 2021. Maybe that's not a realistic expectation. Maybe something more like 2022. Like, that was, I know that felt like a disappointment at the time for folks because he was coming off the near MVP season, but that was a perfectly good season for like a relatively star level first baseman to have. Something like that. Varsho, I'm sure you guys have been talking about the last little bit because he's been in the spotlight as this two-way force. If he's, the bar for him offensively is so low because his defense is good enough. Like last year, he was even kind of a half decent starting player, despite the fact his offense was disappointing. If he's anything offensively, like that's a guy who can move the needle a little bit. And I think the reason we haven't seen a bigger shift overall is you've had some of the guys you relied on last year, have a little bit of early regression, like Bichette. Like, Bichette has been the most steady player for the Blue Jays offensively, arguably for a couple of years now. And he's the one guy who hasn't really been there at the level that you'd hope for. So this happens a lot, early in a season over any stretch of kind of 20-ish games. Some guys you expect to be better than, are worse, and some guys come on a little bit. So while the season has settled in, I think that's fair to say to some degree. We're an eighth of the way through, a little bit more than that. There's still a lot we have to learn about what some of these guys are going to be.
And you've mentioned a couple of those guys. We'll get into Varsho and Bo and numerous other guys around the team. But I'd also kind of be curious about just your thoughts about the American League East again, just being a juggernaut and the Jays' place in that, because it's well over 500 in winning percentage terms, and they're still hovering around kind of middle of the pack. You've got the Yankees running out ahead. You got the Orioles cruising, even with Jackson Holiday struggling out of the gate. Is this a team that at this point has any aspirations of making any kind of division noise, you see?
I mean, it's on the table in a literal sense. I don't think it's fair to rule them out just yet. But you look at the Yankees. That is a really good team with a lot of star power in the lineup, in the pitching rotation. They always seem to find good guys for the bullpen. The Orioles are that young, exciting team. Last year, their results were maybe a little bit lucky, and people maybe got on that train a little bit too soon. But at the same time, like, look at what they've done so far. They haven't given you a reason to doubt them yet. I'm not huge on the Red Sox. Like, the idea that the Red Sox are going to be some excellent team that, the Blue Jays are going to have to really worry about longer term. And the Rays, the Rays are off to a similar start to the Blue Jays, but I think they're a scary team in their own right. Like, everyone knew that this was a really tough division. And I think your hope going in was that you would see early one of the teams would surprise you in a negative way. Like, the Yankees would fall flat out of the gate. Some of the Orioles, they're young players, the progression on them wouldn't be so upwards and linear. And the reality is none of that has happened. Like, it's been, other than the Rays being, I don't know, like 2 to 3 games worse than maybe you would have predicted, this is exactly how you thought it would look. And coming into the season, the Blue Jays had an outside shot at best at winning the AL East, and nothing has really changed in terms of that prognosis.
Yeah, well, I mean, again, it's the toughest division in baseball, right? So it's I don't know if frustrating is the word, but it does feel a little bit kind of like, and again, it's April. It's so early to even be talking about kind of division placement and all that, but it's just kind of there's no reprieve in the blender that is the American League East.
I mean, I guess the good news is that the schedule isn't as quite as focused interdivision as it used to be. But yeah, winning the division, something the Blue Jays have failed to do in this little era, right? And that is a big part of the story of their inability to advance in the playoffs, right? Like the wild card series, I'm not saying they have deserved to get through any of them they've played in. Like, they have been thoroughly outplayed. There's been some unfortunate moments, to be sure, but I don't think you can as a Blue Jays fan, say, oh man, like, they got hosed by this umpire or this call or this play or whatever. Like, they have deservedly lost those series. They haven't won a game. But like, the real goal is to avoid those series in the first place, right? Like, as random as a 5-game series, you could argue even a 7-game series is pretty random at times, but a 3-game series is truly random. And so when you find yourself in that wild card mix, you are, you're the will of the baseball gods will have a lot to say about whether you advance or not, and you really want to avoid those situations. And right now it looks like the Blue Jays, getting that wild card is kind of a good outcome for them, to be honest, at this point. And that's a bit of an unfortunate place to be in, where it's hard to aspire to that greater goal of winning the AL East.
I mean, right now, if you kind of look at like kind of aspiring for the wild card, coming into the series against potentially this year's AL Central champion, the Royals, I'm interested. Kind of, we talked earlier about kind of how the pitching has picked up a lot, and in this past series, we saw Yariel was very good again. Jose Berrios had maybe not his best stuff, but has kind of settled into this run preventing East level pitcher right now to begin the year, and Chris Bassett was not his best as well, but made it through the start, and then had Trevor Richards kind of allow his past 2 runs. I kind of want to zone in on Jose Berrios specifically, and how you're feeling as far as his beginning to the year, because it's an all-star beginning to the year. And I mean, obviously, again, same thing. It's April. We're not casting Cy Young votes at this point. But if he was to kind of regress just a little bit, you still have to figure he would kind of be somewhere in that conversation.
Yeah, I mean, Barrios is a really interesting guy right now because the results are unimpeachable, right? Like, he's got, an ERA below 1 at the moment. And so every time he's gone out, he's given them, I think he's got a 4-0 record. I doubt that this podcast deals in pitcher wins that much. And I certainly don't. But like, the reality is that he's gone out and they've had a very, very good chance to win in every single one of his starts. Is that going to continue? I don't know. There's some stuff that has happened with him that you could say, oh, this is a tangible step forward. Like, he really does seem to be moving away from the 4-seam fastball. That was always an effective pitch for him. Becoming more of the sinker slurve guy seems like a good evolution. He's added a cutter and he's solved left-handed hitters. The results have been good against left-handed hitters, but that pitch hasn't been huge for him. So it's hard to say like, oh, okay, this is a big thing that's changed up what he fundamentally brings to the table. It's an odd statistical profile with him right now, right? Like, he's not striking out a lot of guys. His expected ERA, looking at it right now, is 4.28. So that kind of gap is massive. Part of that is defense. Like I said before, the Blue Jays defense is like truly at an elite level. So a pitcher that lets his defense do some of the work for the Blue Jays is a good pitcher in a lot of ways. But I don't think what he's done out of the gate suggests that he has found some kind of absolute ace level. Like, I'm not placing any Cy Young bets on Jose Berrios right now. You have to appreciate what you've gotten from him, which has really helped the Blue Jays keep their record respectable. But there's a pretty big range of outcomes for the rest of the year here. I think you're still looking at something closer to 2023 than 2022, and it was an absolute disaster. But I'm not, 5 starts in ready to say, okay, he's taken some huge next step and we need to fundamentally view him differently as a pitcher.
Well, I would be curious about that because I mean, obviously results and process are two different things, but like you said, like the results have been unimpeachable is the word you used, right? Is there no value in him being a guy that uses his defense kind of? Because the Jays, their pitching staff, they have a guy like Gosman who is an ace every time he steps out there, but in a lot of respects, it's guys with huge upside. You look at like a Kikuchi and he's been incredible, right? But maybe a guy with weaker peripherals survives on the Blue Jays because of how the team is built. And if that's how they're going to succeed based on their defense, then you may as well make use of it.
Yeah, and I think you could say similar things about Chris Bassett, right? Like, Chris Bassett doesn't strike out a ton of people. He's trying to get relatively soft contact and watch his defense go to work. I think the difference with Berrios is he doesn't really have that same track record of like, I've made soft contact work for me. In fact, the exact opposite has been the case over a lot of his career. Now he's doing a good job of that again this year, but 5 starts is tough, right? Like, one number that I have kind of focused in on with Berrios a little bit is that he's left 99.4% of the men on base. Like, that just is not a real number. Like, that just doesn't happen. Like, at a certain point, you're going to give up a home run. You're going to give up a ball that falls in the outfield. And I know the Blue Jays outfield's fantastic, but even still, you'll give up a gap. Or like, normally that number, like if that number lives at 80, you feel like, oh, this guy's pretty lucky, or he's really kind of zoning in those big moments. Like, there's just been this level of when there's any danger, he's gotten the outs that simply can't continue. Now, again, like you said, there's value in a guy who doesn't put men on base. If he can strike out a respectable number of hitters and let the defense go to work, like, yeah, you're probably looking at what he was last year largely. But if you add this, even 5 starts of this, and then you add last year's full numbers, I can't do all that math in like that second, but the end of year numbers are going to look really good because these 5 starts can't be taken away. Like they are locked in. So by the end of the year, Berrios will probably have better numbers than we expected coming in, almost just because these 5 starts has happened. But what he's going to be from here on out, again, maybe we'll see, but I'm not yet confident in saying like, okay, this is the ace, this is the Cy Young type of guy. Maybe if we had this conversation in a month and this keeps happening, then will have been overly cautious.
I think the entire series, I mean, well, at least through the Berrios and Bassett starts, it felt a lot like where you kind of see the batted ball luck between the two teams, where the Blue Jays had kind of a lot of soft contact falling in, and it felt like the Padres had a lot of hard contact being either tracked down by a Blue Jays outfielder or being hit straight at someone. So I think kind of just looking like purely at that, the way that happened, despite the overall results, I think it's just kind of a good example of kind of just baseball in general. But I want to get your opinion on Yariel Rodriguez, because he had his second start this weekend and I thought looked a lot better. He obviously went a little bit longer. He mixed in a couple extra pitches. What are your expectations for him going forward?
He's an interesting one because a lot of it has to do with what's their level of ambition or caution with him when it comes to his workload and what they want to do with him on a start-to-start basis. Like we saw earlier when they opted to send down Nate Pearson instead of Bowden Francis, that was an indication that's like, okay, they don't necessarily think he's that close to being the traditional starter. Or maybe that's never going to be the plan because his innings limit is going to be at a level where he really is, the 4-inning guy. And if he's really efficient, maybe that's 5 innings. With him also, I don't think he's necessarily going to be that efficient. Like he's a control guy, not a command guy at this point. Like he's not walking tons and tons of hitters, but he's not spotting the ball, which is fine because his stuff is really good. The velocity, I think, is actually better than we would have guessed based on what he did in the spring. The slider is really good. Like he can get in his first start against the Rockies, and the Rockies are a joke lineup. Like, let's be honest about it. And when they're not playing at Coors Field as well, like that's a whole other level to them. Like you could not have put him in a better position to succeed than starting at home against the Rockies. But in that game, he threw a lot of sliders over the middle of the plate, and some of them were like 2 strikes. And I think he had 2 strikeouts that were legitimately sliders in the middle of the plate that like a good team should have hit. And again, that doesn't mean that he's doomed, and it was his MLB debut, and he's going to continue to build on that. With him, I continue to be interested in what do you have beyond the fastball and the slider, because we know he's got the big velocity. We know the slider is a really interesting pitch. And he does have more pitches. He's got the splitter, he's got the curveball, he's got the sinker. We saw a little bit more of the splitter in the second start. But when I watched him pitch, especially in that MLB debut, I thought, man, this guy could be a really good reliever. Like that was my thought watching him start. I was like, this guy could be a hell of a reliever. And so for him to take that next step where he looks like a guy who can consistently get out left-handed hitters, turn the lineup over, I think it will be a little bit about like, okay, how real is that splitter? How real is that curveball? Are those more than show me pitches? And this is a long-term project, right? Like they signed him to a long-term contract. They knew he hadn't really pitched in 2023 much. He wouldn't be able to step in and give them 150 innings or whatever. And so it is interesting because the Blue Jays are a win now organization based on, the age of a lot of their players and the fact that Bo and Vladdy are coming up on free agency. But he's a little bit in the middle of that where they're trying to win now, and he probably is their best option as a fifth starter, but that's maybe an indictment on where Manoah is at more than him. And so they're trying to develop him on the fly. And so far, I think the plan has kind of been executed well, and he's looked pretty good. And they have to be happy with what they've seen from him.
Yeah, I don't disagree at all, especially with the reliever thing. I mean, watching him pitch, I mean, even kind of when he came over, I was like, well, I just feel like he's going to end up a reliever no matter what. But the results have certainly been encouraging. Let's move on to the offense a little bit because I mean, obviously, the offense has been the hot topic for the past 14 months with this Blue Jays team. But I'm kind of interested because obviously Varsho has been great. Schneider and Clement hit home runs last night, but the most concerning player I think on the team so far has almost been Bo Bichette quietly, where obviously everybody yells and screams about Vlad, but Bo has kind of not been Bo to begin the year. And it's not necessarily like he's getting unlucky or if he's not quite looking the same under the hood that he has in the past. So I'm interested what you've seen from Bo to begin the year and maybe as to why he hasn't quite come out of the gates as the same hitter that we've seen in the past.
Yeah, Bo is an interesting one because when you're evaluating hitters, a lot of it is breaking down process and seeing if the process is sound. And arguably his process is never sound, and he's just sort of like talented enough to get by anyway. Like he doesn't walk a ton. He swings through some bad pitches. He gets himself in 2-strike counts more than he needs to. And so he's always been odd. Like I was probably skeptical of Bo, longer maybe than some other people because I was like, at a certain point, this is gonna, if not run out, then it's going to kind of dip to some degree. And it sort of never did. And he's been one of the most consistent guys year to year you could possibly have on a team. And so a lot of that process looks the same. Like he's taken some weird swings. He's getting in some bad counts. He's not walking. He's striking out occasionally. Not a ton this year, actually less than usual. And so the ball off his bat has just not been good. Like on his contact has not been strong pretty much across the board. And has he hit enough? Has there been enough batted balls to really panic about that yet? You could argue no. Like at some point during a season, he tends to have some kind of stretch like this where it's like, oh, wow, he's not hitting for power and it's a lot of balls in play and not a lot to say about it. But yeah, the lack of thump and not even just home runs, like doubles, hard contact. Like he has a decent max exit velocity, but his overall exit velocity is just not impressive at all. So he is definitely one where there's reason to be concerned with him, but he's just harder to parse than other hitters. Like he's kind of like Chris Bassett. Like good luck looking at Chris Bassett after 3 starts and be like, oh, this is where this guy's at. Cause he's like he's just a totally different guy start to start and with all the pitches he throws. in a weird way, Bo has a similar profile where it's just like, I have a hard time being confident that I know what's going on with Bo at any given second. And right now the results are clearly unimpressive. Like there's no two ways about it. I think if you're still looking at this level of poor contact, I don't know, yeah, like 3 weeks, a month from now, then you start to really get concerned about it. But this could still just be sort of a bad Bo stretch, and it just happens to be the stretch at the beginning and the only thing we've seen.
Okay, so as the resident kind of call it doom poster of the podcast, I called this the Chris Bryantification of Bo Bichette because he's looked pretty pedestrian. But it doesn't sound like you're ready to slam the panic button just yet, if I'm hearing you correctly.
No, and I tend to take a longer view of things, and sometimes that's done me well, and sometimes that's not been good to me. I get it. Like I when you watch Bo, like if you're when legitimately you're just watching the games, there's nothing he's done that's been impressive. Like there really hasn't. Like he does all the things you don't want to see in terms of swinging for the wrong pitches and not managing the at bats well, and you're not seeing any of the payoff whatsoever. Like you have kind of one big home run out of him and that's it. And even a lot of his singles have been kind of unimpressive, dribbly type of singles. Like if you look at kind of his expected numbers, they're brutal. His expected numbers are worse than his real numbers, and his real numbers are not good. So this is a difficult position to be in. But when you're talking about a guy, in his age 26 season without massive injury concerns associated with him, normally like a fairly durable player, I mean, Chris Bryant it is definitely an interesting comp because he is someone who around that age started to slip and we never really got a good sense of why. And his career is kind of a big what if. And, that peril could end up being true with Bo because this is always been a weird offensive profile and it never seemed like it would work over the long term. And sure as heck it has over a half decade here. I'm still gonna go with the half decade over the 22 games or whatever, but it's worth monitoring because he was the constant the Blue Jays felt like they could rely on coming into the season, and it is definitely peculiar to see the one guy who you felt like, okay, this is a big offensive driver for us, be the one guy that has been outside of Alejandro Kirk, arguably the worst offensive contributor.
Your optimism is frustratingly refreshing, I would say, about Bo Bichette and the rest of the Blue Jays offense.
It's funny. I've rarely been cast as an optimist, but I think that when I think I'm more of a reasonableist, and when everyone else is negative, it reads like optimism.
Let's flip to maybe something that can be a little more optimistic than Bo Bichette's season so far. Dalton Varsho, another excellent series in San Diego. He hits another home run, makes some great defensive plays. He's another guy where I guess his results so far have been a lot better than kind of the expected stats. And I think we talked about it a little bit last week when we kind of did some more Varsho stuff. Is just obviously he's not going to be a guy that's going to have a 363 WOBA the entire year or be hitting this many home runs, and it just kind of feels like a hot streak. But I'm curious because he has made a little bit of process change and kind of seems to have stuck from that despite going through some struggles early in the season. What do you think Varsho can kind of, obviously he's not going to sustain this hot level like where he's at right now, but what do you think is kind of a good baseline to look at Varsho for where he might be able to settle into going forward?
Yeah, I mean, I think you want to look at his 2022 as sort of what you're shooting for here, where he is above average offensively, not by a massive degree. Like he's seems relatively likely to run a low on base percentage pretty much no matter what. Like even this season, he's got a 306, despite the fact everyone's saying he's doing really well, which he is objectively. It's funny because I was looking into him this morning, and he's someone who, it's kind of the opposite of Bichette. I feel like I'm a little bit more down on. Again, some of this is caution, but I was also looking at sort of what has made him better this year. And what's really made him better is that he's crushing fastballs. And that hasn't always been the case for him. And particularly last year, he struggled with fastballs and he's turning on them. And most of his home runs come off fastballs. Like his run value against four seamers is +7. Last year was -5. Like that's a massive difference. He's one of the best guys in the league by that stat so far this season. And then I was like, okay, let's look at what happened with that. And if you look at his home runs on those fastballs, the velocity on those fastballs are like 91, 92, 92, 94. Like he hasn't changed such that you think like, oh, he's really on top of, high level fastball. And I'm not saying that every 92 fastball is garbage, but it's just like it hasn't sort of fundamentally shifted who he is. The thing that I do like about Varsho this season is that he's not chasing nearly as much. And that was something that showed up in the spring. Like he was really impressive. I believe he finished the spring with more walks than strikeouts, or at least he was there for a lot of it. And so far this season, his chase rate is low 20%. I think, he's got an 85th percentile if you look at that as we record today. He's never been like a totally reckless hacker, but that has a lot to do with helping him. I will say, in terms of his expected stats, he's someone who traditionally comes in above them because sometimes his bunting gets in the race, some of that weirdness. He also has a tendency to pop up a little bit, which is troubling, but sometimes how troubling that is overstated in those stats because like you pop up and your expected value for that is like 0, whereas you ground out, you get like 12% of it, you know what I mean? Like that type of thing. So he's not someone where the expected numbers are the first place that I would generally look. But yeah, he's hot right now. I think he can bounce back approximately to 2022, which is a very, very good player. A very good two-way player. Still, most of the value you expect is going to come from the glove.
Yeah. And also, I was going to say is that the other thing too is don't forget that like when he does hit these, hard balls, there's a lot of pull to his game too. So that's also kind of going to detract from the towering bombs in theory that maybe like a Vlad runs into every now and again. Why his lollipop graph, as I call it, it's all red, whereas with Varsho you're not going to quite get quite as sexy a page there.
Yeah, I mean, there's more value to turning on the ball because the wall is way closer, right? Like, how do you think Kevin Biggio hits home runs? It's like it's not because he's got a ton of raw power; it's because he puts them in the right spot. That's what Varsho's done this year. Danny Jansen is the same way for the Blue Jays. Davis Schneider is the same way too. Like we think of Davis Schneider as this huge power hitter, and in terms of like the raw power in his bat from the speed of his swing and his raw, you can look at him as a person. I'm not trying to diss David Schneider or anything, but like he's not Aaron Judge in terms of his physicality. So like a lot of times, yeah, the placement of these balls matters. And the Blue Jays do have a few guys, yeah, like Jansen, Varsho, Biggio, that they maximize what they have from a power standpoint by really making an effort to turn on the ball. It's like what Jose Bautista used to do. Bautista had a little bit more of that torque in him, so he did have the raw power as well. But that's the philosophy. Is like, let's get out in front of the ball. Let's pull the ball because the wall is closer to us there. We put in the air, and it really doesn't take as much to get it there.
I mean, they signed Justin Turner, who's like a great example of a guy who turned around his career just by hitting the ball in the air and then pulling it a little bit more often. You wrote last week at Sportsnet, why home runs will decide the Blue Jays' fate this season, and it's interesting because they this weekend got home runs. I mean, they got home runs from Turner, Schneider, Clement, and Varsho. And it's an interesting lineup to construct where they add Schneider and Clement last night or yesterday afternoon, and they both leave the yard and in favor of Kevin Biggio and Isaiah kiner-falefa. But obviously the top of the lineup has been the same, and that's kind of where they aren't necessarily getting the home runs from is like the George Springers, the Bo Bichettes. Vlad, of course, has 3, but he's just such a difficult player to parse anyways. I'm interested for you, how would you go about building this Blue Jays lineup on a day-to-day basis?
Yeah, I mean, I think the power is a very real concern. Like when you have that lineup where you're relying on, and they have a good walk rate, a good strikeout rate, they do a lot of things well from a process standpoint, but you are relying on, the single walk, double, all getting all that in the same inning, especially for a team like the Blue Jays that don't run a ton. So it's hard for them to create as much value sometimes out of those hits. It's difficult. I think you do want to really think about injecting this group with power when you can. Does that mean more Davis Schneider in the lineup? Sure. Like he's looked like someone who can deliver power for you. Now, sometimes the vigor the fans get behind the idea that he has to be in every single day, and if he isn't, it's a crime against humanity. And John Schneider is like the worst human who's ever lived. Sometimes that gets a little bit exaggerated, but he is someone to think about because he gives them a different element. Something I'm going to be watching closely in the weeks to come is going to be how they deploy Danny Jansen versus Alejandro Kirk. Because not only has Kirk really struggled this year, But they present it as kind of a 50-50, but at a certain point, it really shouldn't be if one player is significantly overplaying the other. It's complicated because Kirk has been really good actually from a framing standpoint, one of those quiet skills that's like very valuable. But at the same time, again, thinking about the quick strike offense, which has eluded them a lot of last year and this year, Jansen is one that puts them out, and Kirk is very much one who doesn't. And if you look at the top of the lineup, you said the guys they're relying on to do this, Vladdy's been inconsistent. Maybe not as bad as some people are saying, but he's definitely been inconsistent out of the gate. Bo has not been good out of the gate, as we talked about. George Springer, and a couple of years now, like the contact is up, the strikeout rate is down, but he's just not hitting for the same kind of power. Like he looks a little bit like he's doing the Miguel Cabrera thing, where he's trying to stay respectable in terms of kind of batting average and getting on base and things like that, which in a sense works with him being a quote unquote leadoff hitter, like traditional leadoff hitter. Maybe that works to some degree, but he's lost a lot. Like if you think of 2021, like he was one of the best raw power hitters in the majors, 2020, 2019. Like he's not even close to touching that right now. So if you talk about your top three guys, and even Justin Turner, like he's been really good. Absolutely cannot complain about Justin Turner, but not massive home run after master home run guy, like more of a doubles power guy. So when you're building out the bottom of the lineup, I think it is worth considering, if we're not getting as much power from the top, do we want to, overweight the starts we give to Danny Jansen? Do we want to think about Davis Schneider a little bit more? And those are kind of the two levers you have to pull realistically outside of those top four guys that are going to be in there anyway. Because like you can throw Vogelbach in, but then you're losing one of the top guys anyway. So yeah, those are the two guys that their playing time is going to be really interesting because they have a different element.
Well, I mean, there also maybe is another lever in AAA right now that's mashing like anybody. Like nobody would. Well, I mean, top 100 prospect, maybe nobody, but this guy's really turned it on. Orelvis Martinez has suddenly emerged as maybe a guy that could add some thump to this Blue Jays lineup. Is he someone that you're like eyeing up as you got to find a way to maybe like if he forces your hand, got to find a way to get him in? Like he right now is on a different level, and even Addison Barger and Spencer Horwitz to lesser degrees, but a couple guys down there that are hitting the baseball pretty hard.
Yeah, I mean, Orelvis Martinez has been unbelievable, and this has also sort of been his pattern through his minor league career. Like he tends to go up a level and then initially struggle or not be that great, and then slowly find it. And that's fine considering his age, right? He's only 22 years old. And last year he came up to AAA and he was, he hit for power, but he's sort of like narrowly above average as a hitter, and he struck out a lot. And I don't think last season you would have felt comfortable bringing him up. And then this year, I mean, as you said, and especially in the last couple of days, like he's been unbelievable, home run after home run. He's cut down on the strikeouts a little bit. We're talking about 18 games, so it's a little hard to say. He's still not walking a ton. It's interesting because the positions that he would play are ones where the guys on the Blue Jays are actually playing relatively well right now. I don't know if they're going to rush him per se, but what he's done, even in 18 games here, makes me feel a lot more confident we're going to see him this season than I would have said coming out of spring, where he didn't actually really impress during spring training. Not that that's the be all and end all, but yeah, I think it's likely that you'll see what he can do at some point, because it gets to a place where him at AAA isn't necessarily adding much to his development, and the Blue Jays, even if it's not literally an everyday role, but if they feel like he's not learning much in AAA and this is a win now team, as I said before, and he can help them win, I think he's absolutely on the radar. I don't think that he's someone that's like coming up tomorrow or next week. I think like it's reached that kind of level of frenzy where people are like, oh, another home run. Like it brings me back to the Josh Tolley times when he absolutely had to come up after that huge run there. But yeah, there's nothing more he could have done for himself in the first few weeks of the season. And I think his stock is absolutely going up. And, Barger is not the headliner, but he's done really, really well at the same time. And, he's someone else who is definitely interesting to this team longer term and maybe at some point during 2024.
Do you think that there's any value in looking at what the Blue Jays did with Davis Schneider last year, where he had to almost force their hand and then some before being able to get the call up. Like it was kind of the same thing where the calls were there for Schneider to come up. He was having a really great year with Buffalo before getting called up in August, despite like them struggling offensively. Again, it's kind of same thing to open the year. Do you think that there's like anything to draw from that? Like, do you think that them taking so long to bring up Schneider last year and then him immediately succeeding and will inform their decision in any way for Orelvis?
It's interesting because I think some of this goes to the unfairness inherent in baseball. I'm sure you can talk to plenty of minor leaguers about this, but at the time, Davis Schneider was not seen as a big time prospect. He was seen as like an interesting guy who kept succeeding within the organization, which is, fair based on his kind of unusual way of going about his business and the fact that he was a very late draft pick. Like there was always reasons to be skeptical of Davis Schneider. And it turned out a lot of those reasons were maybe invalid in the end, but the reasons were there. And when it comes to Orelvis Martinez, like this guy has been considered a top prospect for a long time. He is young for his level still, even though it seems like we've been hearing about him forever. And so I think he's perceived in a little bit of a different way where maybe the bar for him isn't as high to make it because there's that level of belief in him to begin with. And some of the doubts you might have about Schneider in terms of like, is the strikeout rate going to climb too high at the major league level? I think you have those same doubts about Orelvis. In some ways, there's some similarity in their games, as different as they are as human beings and as prospects. But Orelvis is the kind of guy who tends to get the benefit of the doubt. I think Barger is maybe a little bit more comparable to Schneider, where Barger was someone who's kind of had to work and at every level sort of prove himself for the organization to believe that he's getting there. But when you get those guys who have always been well regarded, I guess we'll see how long it takes, but those guys tend to get the benefit of the doubt.
All right. Before we let you run here, just with the week ahead, playing 4-game series in Kansas City against the Royals and then coming back home against the Dodgers. Anything specific that you're going to be kind of monitoring or watching this week what are you looking for this week?
I think the Royals series is going to be fascinating because the Royals are a fascinating team. Like you could say, oh, it's always fun to watch the Dodgers. Absolutely. Like, it's a star-studded team. It's kind of it's weird to say it's like a privilege when they come to town, but it kind of is. Like if you have the ability to go to one of these games, I would suggest people take that opportunity. The Royals are just, they're not where anyone would have guessed. And yet, if you kind of comb through what they've been doing, there's not a lot of it that seems particularly fluky. Like they've hit well, they've pitched well. For them, a lot of their success has come from the real core, kind of different, opposite from the Blue Jays in a sense, but like the core of their lineup has been awesome. Like Bobby Witt Jr., Pasquantino, and Perez have all been really, really good. So what I'm looking for in this series is, are the Blue Jays able to slow those three guys down? Because I think if they do, they should have a relative amount of success with the rest of the lineup. So that is going to be interesting. Like, will John Snyder be a little bit more cautious, having a pitcher go 3 times through the lineup against those guys? How is he going to use the relievers against that? Because that's where I see, that's probably the biggest advantage the Royals have right now is that you have 3 guys very talented, absolutely rolling right now. And it'll be fascinating to watch how they handle that on the Blue Jays side.
I think the Royals were just about everybody in baseball's breakout pick before the season. And lo and behold, the early returns have been pretty good for them.
Oh, they've been impressive. There's no doubt.
You kind of mentioned the Dodgers there. I'm just going to throw this out there. What is the Shohei Ohtani reaction this weekend in Toronto?
I don't think that people are I think they're, if anything, I think the Blue Jays fan anger tends to channel its way to the front office almost regardless of what's actually happened. So I think that the anger is about the front office's failure to bring Shohei Ohtani to Toronto, or the fact that they were sold hope that was never really going to happen. So I don't think there's hostility to Ohtani as a person. And I think a lot of, especially kind of real baseball fans, I don't know, I'm not trying to gatekeep anyone, but people who are like fans of baseball beyond just the Blue Jays, I think are likely to appreciate that it's just awesome to see this guy. Like he's a historical figure in the sport. He's unbelievable to watch. I know that you don't see the pitching side of him this season, but yeah, I mean, if he got boos raining down on him, not only would I be surprised, I think that'd be a very odd place for fans to place their energy.
Yeah, it'll be interesting. I'm sure there's going to be a decent number of plane jokes heading into the weekend, but
Lot of signs, lot of
yeah,
signs.
regardless, it'll be fun for sure. It's always great to see those generational talents in Toronto and being able to play against them for sure. Well, Nick, thank you so much for your time today. We really appreciate you joining this. Really great conversation, and we'll keep following along with your coverage and wish you the best of luck for the rest of the season.
Well, thank you. It was a pleasure to come on.
All right, well, that will do it for us here today at the Bird's Eye View podcast. Make sure to drop a follow or review wherever you get your pods. You can like and subscribe on YouTube. We are there at Bird's Eye View Pod. You can follow us all on Twitter. Nick is at Nick Ashbourne. Once again, he is a Blue Jays contributor at Sportsnet and the co-host of the Blue Jays Happy Hour podcast. I'm at Worden_Zach. Jori is at Jori Negin-Shecter, and the pod is at BEV_pod. Thanks so much for listening, and we'll catch you later this week.